So I think we are moving now into our first keynote. Am I correct? And we're right on time. So I'd like to invite Professor Lily Kong and Koichi to come up on stage. Yeah, you want to watch the PowerPoint. Okay. But Lily, you can't watch your own PowerPoint. To most people here, Professor Lily Kong needs no introduction in a formal sense because she is, as you'll read in your program, Vice President of University and Global Relations at NUS and also Vice Provost of Academic Personnel of NUS. So in my reading, basically you run the university. So we're particularly fortunate that she's taken time out to come and open a conference which has as its theme Beyond the Culture Industry. I've known Lily Kong's work actually for a long time because in co-teaching with my colleague Stephen Chan a course on cultural policy and institution, we used to set as reading the pioneering essays that Lily Kong wrote on what once upon a time, a long time ago, seemed the bizarre emergence of a cultural policy mission in Singapore, of all places. Lily was one of the first to grasp the implications of this and to start mapping events, trying to understand them and giving them a historical and social genealogy. So her work has been profoundly foundational for serious work on cultural industries and creative industries and policy in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. So with great pleasure, I'll invite Professor Kong to speak.
Good morning, everyone. And thanks to Megan for those very kind words. I would just add a caveat that I am not responsible for the sins of this university at all. Bing Huat bought me a nice dinner and said, "Would you come and do this?" And I, after eating the dinner, I couldn't say no. So I'm very happy to be here. I suspect that what I'm going to say is not quite what he had in mind, perhaps, when he invited me to give this particular talk, but I interpreted the theme of Beyond the Culture Industry in a way that I have been thinking about it. As Megan mentioned, I started off doing work on cultural policy, cultural industry to some extent, and then, this big burst in both policy circles and in academic circles about creative industries sort of intruded into my beginning works in this area, and I sort of began to engage with this whole notion of creative industries and creative economies and creative everything else. And I did, I confess to actually having written stuff about the creative industries and creative economies, creative cities, etc. Edited a collection on the so-called creative cities, looking at Asia and Europe. And this conference and its theme actually gave me the opportunity to rethink some of my own ideas about what the creative industries mean and whether, as a concept, it makes any sense. So what I'd like to do is figure out how to use this. Right. Well, you probably haven't got a title of my paper in the conference program because I didn't have one till 2 days ago. But basically, I would like to talk about the move from cultural industries to creative industries and ask the question about whether this whole category of the creative industries makes any sense and whether or not we should be moving back into talking about cultural industries. I want to think about this in two terms, in theoretical terms as well as in policy terms very briefly. So what I'd like to do is to very quickly run through the sort of genealogy, if you will, from culture industry to cultural industries to creative industries and the whole creative discourse, so to speak. The bulk of what I will spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about is what I think is problematic with the so-called cultural, the creative turn. And I want to use the opportunity of thinking about what is problematic about the creative turn to help us think about clarifying theory and rethinking policy as such. So first, from culture industry to cultural industries to creative industries. Now, a lot of this will be familiar, I think, to many of you, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. But, this is not new to you. You know this in your sleep. So I'm really just going to say that, this whole notion of culture industry cannot but bring us back to Adorno and Horkheimer's sort of essay in 1944 about the culture industry and enlightenment as mass deception. And as you know very well, this is really a critique about the production of cultural commodities for monetary gains and the standardization as a consequence, the standardization of cultural commodities. The fact that through commoditization, the emphasis is on public appeal rather than creativity, rather than real talent as such. And many sorts of cultural commodities that were embraced within the fold of the culture industry, the film, television, music, etc., etc. Now, this is well familiar to you. The move to the plural form of cultural industries was, in a sense, an acknowledgement of the complexity and the interconnectivity of different sectors of cultural production. The uniqueness of each special field, each specific field, so that they cannot all be treated as one, and they needed to be theorized differently, and the policies towards them needed to be addressed differently, some perhaps in related ways, in certain common ways, but also in unique ways. And this really, I think we should acknowledge the work of later thinkers like Walter Benjamin and Bernard Miege. And here we witness, I think, a theoretical shift, whereas in the earlier days, the culture industry was really very much a criticism about the commoditization of culture as, in a sense, killing off creativity, killing off the creative impulse as such. Here, there was a recognition that the incorporation of culture within a capitalistic framework is not necessarily straightforwardly negative, that it is in fact a site of struggle, a site of tension, a site of conflict and contestation, and there is no straightforward loss to capitalism as such. Indeed, there is the possibility within that struggle for capitalism to bring along with it resources and technologies that can contribute to the creative process. So it's not a celebration wholesale, but an acknowledgement of the contestation and the site of struggle that the cultural industries present as such. Now, the shift to creative industries was, I think, led actually by a policy shift. And this, I think we link to what happened with the new Labour government of Tony Blair in Britain in 1997, when they coined, for themselves, the term creative industries as a classifier for many of its policy sectors. And this replaced the use of the term cultural industries within that particular political and policy context. Here, there was a broadening of what creative industries embraced, and the inclusion of the entertainment and leisure business into all of that. And elsewhere, I have written about the travel of this particular discourse and the travel of a particular normative policy script from that sort of context into many other parts of the world, not least in many cities in Asia and Australia. So many of you, I suspect, will be familiar with the efforts in many cities. In Shanghai, for example, the establishment almost overnight of first 50, then 70, then 80, then 110 creative clusters. This has happened in other cities, like Hangzhou, for example, in China, but also in Australia, in Darwin, and so forth, in Singapore, in South Korea, there has been this travel of the creative economy or creative industries discourse and the creative city discourse, as well as the policy instruments, regardless of the specific contexts that this normative policy script travels to. The likes of Richard Florida and Charles Landry are paid huge amounts of money to arrive a day before a presentation, make their observations, and the next day sort of pronounce their recommendations for what the city should do to become creative. So that sort of creative industry thing also witnessed a certain parallel discursive shift in academic work. And here, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, except to flag that whereas we talked about cultural economy, in the 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s, creative economy sort of took a hold. That language took a hold. Whereas cultural clusters and cultural quarters was what sort of seized the imagination at one point in time, people started talking about the creative clusters. And if you actually examine the details of some of that language and some of the theoretical thinking behind it, or indeed the policy sort of motivations and instruments, they were not necessarily vastly different as such. What did emerge, which perhaps wasn't as prominent when the notion of culture or cultural was used previously, was the emergence of the creative city discourse. And the idea that a creative city is something that can be made, can be produced, that through specific policy instruments, creative cities can be devised. And what is a creative city? The idea that this is a city, an environment where people can think, plan, act with imagination, and can harness opportunities to address urban issues through harnessing the creative impulse as such. But in actual terms, in many cities, this was translated in terms of hardware and software. Hardware in terms of high-grade amenities, things like museums, art galleries, concert halls. And you see this across cities, across many cities in Asia. The Shanghai Grand Theatre, the Shanghai Museum, the Beijing National sort of Theatre that came up, Hong Kong's effort at the West Kowloon Cultural District, which was a bit confused about whether it was a real estate development or whether it was a cultural initiative or a creative industry initiative, and Singapore with its Esplanade and the revamp of the National Museum, etc., right? So these sorts of cultural amenities, if you will, coupled by what I would call an aestheticized land use intensification through the reuse and the recycling of old building stock. So your old factories that have been converted in Shanghai, Moganshan Lu, in Taipei, Huashan Park, the old beer factories, 798 798 in Beijing, and so forth, right? A big part of this whole creative city thing was about city branding. It was about projecting the city and I've written about this elsewhere, in projecting a city in the race towards global city status as one deserving of global city or world city labeling, and its aura of producing and supporting a particular lifestyle, a particular culture, and so forth, right? And so, at last count, there are at least 60 cities, but I think it's now about 80 cities that proclaim themselves to be either creative cities or have the ambition to be a creative city, ranging from Bilbao to Yokohama, right? And I cite just some examples there. So, so as a fellow geographer, Jamie Peck, who's critiqued this whole idea about the creative cities creative economy, has said, there was a certain centrality of the notion of creativity in the 2000s. And he says we have entered an age of creativity comprehended as a new and distinctive phase of capitalist development, in which the driving forces of economic development are not simple technological and organizational, not simply technological and organizational, but human. Right? Now, given this sort of, first confusion between cultural and creative, etc., and then, in a certain sense, a certain dominance of the language of the creative, many scholars, and I worry about this because I see many PhD students in many universities now sort of doing work on the creative industries and creative cities and the creative economy and so forth. But there's beginning, I think, to be a question about what all this means and whether that, in fact, has been a sort of red herring, both theoretically and in policy terms. And so I'd like to spend the next little while talking about what is problematic about the creative term. And I suppose I see 7 areas of it seemed appropriate at the point I was writing it to call them the 7 deadly sins. The first is, what exactly are the creative industries? And I will elaborate on each of these. The second is, how economically beneficial exactly are the creative industries where they have been touted to be the answer to urban decline and the needs of economic regeneration? The third is this whole question of whether culture has in fact been neglected and real creativity stifled in the efforts towards developing creative economies. The fourth turns attention to the people actually involved in the creative industries and asks the question about whether creative labor has been utopianized to its own detriment. The fifth has to do with creative industry policies and how they serve big companies and external expertise as opposed to supporting small and medium scale enterprises and local cultures. The fifth has to do with the question of whether we should be clarifying whether creativity is for innovation and economy or for culture and social quality and social equality as such. And whether there's been a sort of conflation of the two and a criticism of the failure of the creative industries because of conflation of the two. And lastly, I asked the question of whether the possibility or the policy of creating creative cities is in fact a fallacy. So I'd like to go through each of these and hope you will bear with me. What exactly are the creative industries? There is a lack of consensus about which subsectors should really be part of the creative industries. There is a lack of an international classification system, if one was helpful. And in different places, there are different senses of what constitutes the creative economy. Now, you might think that difference is fine, not a problem. So if you take the DCMS example, that's the Department of Culture, Media and Sports in Britain, there is a diverse mix of different subsectors that are thrown into this category, but no real sense of how they're connected, what the common links are, why some are in and some are out, and so forth, right? So the trouble with that is that when data is collected about the contributions of this particular sector to the economy, then it's almost anything goes. It's how you define it, and you can sort of say how wonderfully it is contributing to the economy by defining it the way you want to define it, in a sense, right? And that has, in fact, happened in many city governments where the definitions are loose. If you take, for example, the design industry, take furniture design. Do you take the designers? Do you include their contributions? Do you include them as part of the creative workforce? Or do you take the carpenters who are actually doing the work on the ground as part of that chain? Where do you draw the lines as to contribution to economy? And yet, policies are being made on unclear definitions, a lack of boundaries, and depending on who has a louder voice in government in terms of promoting or pressing down creative economies, you can use the data in different ways that to make the case that you want to make. The other criticism about what exactly are the creative industries is this, that if creative industries are based on creativity to produce creative products, and if creative industries are linked bound up very much with the generation of intellectual property and economic benefits, as is often used as a definition of this sector, then the question arises as to why the creative industries very often are defined to include mainly only cultural activities. What about science and research and development, for example, for which one arguably could say that there is a lot of creative input into the entire process. So here, I think this whole need for clarification as to whether we're talking about culture, or I beg your pardon, creativity as cultural and aesthetic, as Alan Scott puts it, or whether we're thinking about creativity within the folds of scientific and technological work. And to extend that even further, there is, of course, the question of whether is it not the case that every industry to be successful actually requires creativity to thrive? It is not limited to those working in the so-called creative professions as such. So is this just a theoretical sort of minefield and quicksand that, we could work through and define in ways that we're comfortable with or continue to debate as we wish? As I've mentioned, it does have actual implications when this sort of unreliability of data supports actual policy making, right? And again, there are examples from GCMS and OECD when they put together their reports, for example, citing the annual growth of the creative economy to be several times that of manufacturing, for example. Now, what exactly are you defining as the creative industries? What are you including? Who are you including in that process, and so forth, right? So, are these glowing statistics that are often trotted out about the creative industries accurate, or are they misleading? And that is not resolved, and as I said, it becomes mired in the politics of policy making in many different cities. So I've sort of dealt with the first two questions together in the sense that the lack of clarity of what the creative industries are in the first question leads to real sort of problems in dealing with how economically beneficial they are, which is my second question. Slides are no use if I don't flash them, are they? Sorry. Happy to share the slides if anybody wants to cure insomnia. Third, has culture in fact been neglected, and has real creativity sort of been stifled as such? So, first, we know the sort of criticisms against the culture industry from Adorno and Horkheimer's days. But that connection between art and culture and economy is long-standing, right? It's not a new phenomenon. So why this beating of the breast about, sort of culture being neglected, that, we're going to the lowest common denominator, we are catering to the masses and their, sort of tastes rather than being engaged in actual developing of new cultural idioms, new cultural voices, that sort of thing. Now, if that's been a long-standing issue, is this criticism of the creative industries anything new? In one sense, it's not. Those same criticisms that were leveled at culture industry emerge again in this whole sort of debate about creative industries. That, it actually has been overtaken by the economic rationale, that the frameworks, theoretical as well as policy frameworks, are really driven by economic analysis and economic gain, that culture and the arts are only valued because they drive economic growth all those sorts of things, that's a very familiar refrain. So, what is the issue? I would suggest that actually by returning to that sort of discourse, the notion of creative industries and the critique of creative industries actually represents a theoretical backslide. Because the movement from culture industry to cultural industries already, I would suggest, acknowledged the complexities, the contestations and struggles, so much so that it is not a straightforward case of if you've got cultural industry, you are killing culture. That it is much more that the injection of these cultural activities into the capitalistic system is much more a site of struggle and contestation, and is not a straightforward, simple case of sort of killing of culture, so to speak. So theoretically, the notion of creative industries and how it has been critiqued, to me, has taken a step back theoretically, and there should, I think, be time spent more profitably about thinking about how to rethink the theoretical category of the creative and its related notions of creative industry, creative city, etc., which I will come to towards the end of this session. Now, the fourth question that I raise is about whether creative labor has been utopianized to its detriment. And there's much more literature on this now. The whole notion of the creative workforce, the creative class, we can blame this on Richard Florida, right? The development of a workforce that is flexible, multi-skilled, mobile. They have the freedom to do what they want. Largely self-employed. The word entreployees has been used, which is to say that it's a combination of entrepreneurs and employees. They have portfolio careers, and these conditions were characterized, at least in the initial phase, very positively as conditions that support creative work, creative thinking, creative production, because they're not constrained by the structures of the traditional firm, for example, right? But there is an issue of this concept of creative labor and creative workers being over-valorized and utopianized, and their work and life celebrated in ways that actually has prevented actual policy interventions that are necessary to help improve their lives as such, right? So the step towards that acknowledgement comes with recognizing the challenges that creative workers on flexible working arrangements encounter. These challenges very often center on the precarity or the precariousness of the lives of these flexible workers, the job insecurity, the uncertainty, the anxiety over the contingent nature of work, the income instability, the lack of access to pension plans, the exploitation. I have interviewed many people in these industries who talk about how they bring an idea to the would-be sort of employer, and the project is not given to them, but the idea is taken and passed on to somebody else. The lack of protection by unions or collectives. These are all issues surrounding the precarity that confront the creative workers. And by celebrating this category and promoting them without thinking about the dark side, if you will, really it is to the detriment of this category of workers. And as I suggest here, in part because of this utopian discourse about creative workers, the policies to improve the working conditions of these workers are actually not as forthcoming as they might have been. And I wonder, and I really do wonder, whether there would have been a better chance at policy intervention if we return to the notion of a cultural worker, recognizing the poor, struggling cultural worker, rather than celebrating the creative worker as such. And so, theoretically and in policy terms, I really do think that there is the urgent need to recalibrate the concept of creative worker, and I see this happening more in recent times, from celebration to problematization of the category as such. Number five, do creative industry policies serve the big companies and very often external expertise, or support SMEs and local cultures? I have 4 cases that I have looked at, but I may not have time to go through all of them. The first I will say, because the studies about Britain actually celebrate the creative industry policies and suggest that actually the creative industry policies have enabled the shift in focus from supporting large nationally owned manufacturing industries to locally embedded networks of small and medium-sized enterprises. Justin O'Connor and his collaborator Hussein have written about this, and they applaud the fact that this shift has allowed numerous small-scale arts and cultural groups to benefit from the range of economic development policies in the UK. Intuitively, I thought that was rather too sanguine a position. And so I looked at various other cases, Singapore, Barcelona, Western Australia. I won't have time to go into all of them, so I will just tarry a little bit on the Singapore case. And that is to say that when in the early 2000s, Singapore embarked on this whole creative industry, support for creative industries, by which the relevant government departments meant, as they defined it, arts and culture, media and design, and its various subsectors within that. What they did was to go out, and Colleen and Chris and Petrus, we were talking about this yesterday, that the Singapore government would generally, if it wants to start something new and there isn't the seeds of that here, let's just go look somewhere else. Even if there are the seeds of some initiatives here, let's go look somewhere else nonetheless. Right? So going out and reaching for Lucasfilm, Tech McCoy, International Federation of Interior Architects and Designers, etc. Right? Going elsewhere to look for the big names, Electronic Arts, United International Pictures, etc. Bring them to Singapore. Right? Bring them to Singapore. And the question then is, what about the small-scale, locally evolved, organically developed groups that are trying to do their thing? Right? And the sort of fieldwork that I've done suggests that, unlike the British case, which Justin and Singh are very optimistic about, the scene on the ground here is not as positive at all, which is that the international companies that come in, well, they have the big base, the long history, and they bring huge competition for the local groups that are trying to find their feet, or perhaps, are really making it very difficult for the local groups to develop their own sort of voices and their own space within the industry. The other dimension of it, not looking at it from this SME perspective, but looking at it from the workers' perspective, is that these people in Singapore who have some skills that could have been developed and could have been used in the SMEs are then hired into the big industries. And in being hired into the big industries are paid at a level that very often are not paid at the same level as those who are brought in from elsewhere. The locals, they don't have that long experience, they're deemed to be less qualified, less experienced, etc., etc. And so it creates a sort of two-tier system and creates a situation where on the ground there is a feeling of, if you're developing the creative industries, by bringing in the big players, you're actually killing off the opportunities for the local players. So that's one example, and I will skip the Barcelona and the Western Australia examples in the interest of time, and move on to my sixth sort of area of discussion, which is creativity for innovation and economy, or is it for culture and social quality and social equality as such? And so creative class strategies have been sort of criticized in recent times as inappropriate for reviving declining cities, whereas they had initially been touted as the answer to reviving declining cities and the answer to urban and economic regeneration. Why have they been criticized as inappropriate? First, because it is thought that they promote rather than challenge the existing neoliberal urban agenda. They coexist with urban socio-economic and socio-spatial problems rather than solve them. They do not address problems like structural unemployment, poverty, racialized exclusion, and so forth. And in fact, they contribute to a widening income gap and contribute to the emergence of a low-wage service underclass, right? This results in a class of workers who struggle to find stable employment, affordable housing, social support, and so forth, and they contribute to dispossession through gentrification. These are the sorts of criticisms that have been leveled at creative class, creative economy strategies. At the same time, it is also thought that they obscure women, minorities, and low-income groups, that Florida's notion of a progressive creative class actually reproduces socioeconomic inequalities and valorizes hegemonic masculinity and so forth, right? I'm happy to elaborate on more of this, but I'm actually quite conscious that I am eating away the minutes more than I should. And also the criticism that they transform the image of the city rather than the reality of the city as such. So here I actually think that I want to defend a little bit the impetuses of or the moves towards creative industry policy to some extent, unlike what I had been saying previously. And the reason why I want to put in a word of defense is because I think that there are misplaced expectations and excessive pressure on creative industries to address a whole host of economic and social issues all at the same time, right? They are meant to develop the economy, contribute to economic development, but they're also criticized for not contributing to social inclusion, development of social capital, and so forth. And so the question I have is whether, we need to rethink this sort of theoretical stance that, creative industry, creative economy is lacking because it does not address all these problems. Now, since when did we hope that manufacturing policy would address all these problems? Okay. So why do we insist on imposing this on the creative industries as such? And so I think that there is an urgent need to separate between the notion of creativity for innovation and economy and creativity for culture and social equality. And this separation or acknowledgement that sometimes they need to be separated needs to flow into policy as well. So finally, what is a creative city? Again, thanks to Richard Florida, this concept has gained popularity. It's understood as an urban area where creativity, knowledge, innovation flourish because of various factors. A critical mass of people who can encourage human interaction, spark creativity, diversity, dynamic environment, reduced to the 3 T's for Florida, for those of you familiar: transparency, the gay index, etc. Right? So there's a certain formulation, indeed formula, that thanks to people like Florida have seized and taken over the sort of policy discourse and is prevalent to some extent in the academic discourse, although facing a great deal of pushback. Right? A great deal of pushback. The question I ask is whether creative cities can be deliberately constructed. This is what city governments in so many places are trying to do. They, with the help of the tarmac professors that I mentioned earlier, right? Those who turn up for a day and then advise government the next day. So one argument is that, yes, these creative cities can be constructed with the right formula. And the strategy really is to try and attract the creative class through having all these kinds of things. No, the argument goes, because such conditions may not actually attract creative individuals, that creative cities do not result simply from the congregation of creative individuals. The nature of creativity is spontaneous and unpredictable, and creativity is relative and situational, not universal or independent. There is no standard formula, and there is a need to acknowledge and speak to the specific local conditions. A related part of the questioning here is the question of whether creative cities can and do stimulate economic growth as touted. And as I've mentioned earlier, this is fraught with difficulties because of the definitional and the data issues. And the outcome very often is not even guaranteed, even if you can measure the outcomes, right? So in some of the literature, there is now a sort of pushback to the extent that there are those who say that what really matters in cities is not this whole creative thing. People simply go where there are jobs, whatever jobs there are. If there are no jobs, you can have a hip city and they're not going to go. Right? So the argument here is forget about trying to be a cool city. Just concentrate on your high-quality career opportunities. Grow your economic base. Okay, so this sort of, should we develop creative cities? How do we develop creative cities? Are they actually effective in stimulating economic growth? There is precious little accurate, reliable data, and yet city governments have rushed ahead, to do a lot of this. Now, very quickly, I'm going to turn to what I think is needed in terms of clarifying theory. I think that creative industry, as it has developed, the concept of the creative industry has developed, has been an unhelpful category for various reasons. The creative work in industries beyond the aesthetic, the cultural, the affective, has really not been considered or theorized in any seriousness. The category, if it were to involve and embrace all these other dimensions, the scientific, the technological as well, then becomes so broad as to confound analysis and practical feasibility. The category is so broad because you could include all kinds of sectors and all kinds of industries, and it's confusing because it tries to embrace both economic and social policy all at the same time. And there is a serious danger of misleading policy, or at least impeding appropriate policy implementation through misleading growth data, as I mentioned earlier. It actually impedes helpful policy towards creative workers and towards the development of creative clusters. And from a theoretical standpoint, the critique of creative industry that has been attempted has actually been a theoretical backslide, I think. And so, what do I think actually needs to be done? I think that we need a more useful formulation or reformulation of creative industries if you're to continue using it. And I asked myself whether or not the cultural industries formulation that Benjamin and Nieja had sort of come up with, had introduced, might actually be a more helpful starting point if we were to re-theorize creative industries all over again. This more productive theorizing, I think, could also focus on a few dimensions, theorizing about people, analyzing the dynamics of precarity, understanding the balance between freedom and precarity, certainty and risk. More productive theorizing about place, analyzing the logics of clusters. The whole creative cluster sort of literature, including the empirical studies, has very often assumed the logics of business clusters and industrial clusters from Michael Porter, from, good gracious, Alfred Marshall, way back when, not necessarily recognizing the distinctiveness of these different clusters, that cultural clusters or creative clusters, if you want to call them such, have different logics from industrial and business clusters, and elsewhere I've tried to do the empirical work to flesh this out, and I apologize I don't have time to actually elaborate on them. More productive theorizing about economy, analyzing business relationships, the dynamics between big business and small local enterprise. Is it a simple case, almost the way in which I caricatured it earlier, that the introduction of big business inevitably kills our small business? Or how do those relationships actually take place? And this goes into the realm of economic geography, which I am not an expert in. And perhaps even more productive theorization about the concept of creativity itself. Analyzing the sociality of the concept of and the practice of creativity, that creativity perhaps is a social phenomenon. Wherein lies the sociality, or the neurology and the psychology of that, understanding the nature of the creative process itself might be even more productive theorizing, I think, than sort of going on about, what a creative cluster is, or developing a creative city, and so forth. Finally, in terms of rethinking policy, and I will be quite quick with this, it's just one slide, I think for each context that wants to draw on the creative industries, there is a need to revisit the industrial sectors. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about the creative industries? And trying to avoid the conflation of data and policy instruments, clarifying the policy intent and instruments and interventions, and recognizing that there is no magic bullet, that the same one policy is not going to address all your economic and social woes and your cultural ambitions all at the same time. And focusing on appropriate approaches that try to keep balance, privilege certain dimensions which deserve privileging, and protect certain dimensions which deserve protection. For example, the relative support of large companies and SMEs, the financing of hardware or software, and this whole thing about, buying into global currency and bringing in the big names as opposed to recognizing and celebrating and supporting local history and culture. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. I can't think of a more comprehensive, clear and exciting launching of the central theme of this conference. To give a discussant response, it's also my pleasure now to introduce Professor Koichi Iwabushi, whose writing will be familiar to many of you, both in his own right and in collaboration with Chua Beng-Huat, on Japan-focused globalization thinking, critically, but more simply and accessibly for everyone on East Asian popular culture. He's now, I'm curious to know whether to his pleasure or regret, a professor in the Australian university system, a sorrow that we share. Koichi.
Yes. Let me tell my regret for 1 hour or something. Anyway, thank you very much for Megan, and thank you very much for Lily for your very nice talk. Yeah, last night I had a very bad dream. Still, I remember. So I was playing golf. I tried to hit the ball, but I couldn't for some reason. I changed my location from many places, but I couldn't. So I ended up, I couldn't hit the ball at all, and I cried. So this is a kind of omen over today. Discussant, So such a good, very comprehensive, introduction to critique of creative industry discourse and the practices offered by Lily. I think it's hard to make some intervention with your own lecture by itself. But my role is maybe put some my own comment and my own suggestion for further discussion in this keynote session and also during these 3 days conferences. Actually, I met Lily more than 15 years ago in late 70s in Australia. No, 90s. 96 or 7, I think. Yeah, so it was the time I visited Beng-Huat's office in the US at the same time. And so it was a kind of a cultural industry mode of time still. So just before British government announced launch of a creative industry policy in the 50s. And then after then, we know how this idea of creative industry has been developed, adapted, or internationally circulated, including many parts of Asia as well. But actually, initially, I'm curious why Ben asked me to be a discussant, because I have not worked on creative industry at all. I'm really sick of reading, listening to this term. I found the term creative itself quite fishy. Substantial, particularly in Japanese context. Japanese creative industry policy was adopted in Japan 3 years ago, but nothing substantial. So maybe Singapore is quite different, or maybe China to this extent. But from looking at Japan or other East and Southeast Asian countries, while the term creative industry has been adopted, but the policy is quite different. But today, I think maybe two things I would just add, the maybe wider background of the rise of our creative industries as just academic discourse and also policy implementation. And so, maybe you remember in cultural studies we have a kind of policy term in the 90s. At the time, of course, Tony Bennett or others tried to more practically intervene with the actual situation, with a kind of critical mind. So I think to quote Graham Turner, who is another Australian scholar, point, he said, so cultural policy studies agenda was largely in accord with the core activity of cultural studies, in that it has its eyes firmly fixed on the public good. This understood as distinct from the politicized objective of the government and from the commercial objective of the cultural industries. And so that's why I think there are many critiques against this kind of Foucauldian notion of policy, cultural policy in the 90s. But I think, as Turner said, because still critical policy studies with shares a kind of critical minded orientation of studying culture. And so we work together. I think for me at least, I endorse and I read many of these articles. But I think this kind of policy term, I think the rise of the first initial moment of, I think, creative industry discourse still retain this momentum. But as marketization and also a kind of national interest term made this kind of commitment less, I think, visible. And so I think in this sense maybe academic discourse, so because critical studies of cultural policy was more academic discourse. But now I think creative industries are more driven by the state and also many people concerned with the industries, academics. And so this kind of, I think, momentum is being lost. I think that's why I think I do agree with Lily's many critiques, problematics of creative industry now, so A to G, so 7 cases. But at the same time, I think, wider term, not just creative industry, but I think we also observe the kind of social term, if you like, or individual term. So social term means so we pay more attention to more socioeconomic inequality, marginalization, and actual, not just representation or consumption moment of a media culture, but a more production side on the actual inequality in the real world. And also, of course, we witnessed the rise of social media in the last 10, 15 years. And also, we are getting more interested in the kind of social relation or social connection by people's various uses of the media, particularly digital media. So here comes, maybe you know very well, a convergence culture thesis by Jenkins. And so, no boundary between producer and consumer anymore, the decline of the mass media, and also people can, or many marginal groups can use the digital media for their own purposes, for their empowerment. So I think this is a very important moment for the discourse of, initial discourse of particularly creative industries. And so such kind of discourse still is concerned with social democratization and empowerment of various people, individual groups in society. So that's why we should maybe take the discourse of creative industry or convergence culture seriously. Why I do not agree with very optimistic, explanation of what's going on by convergence culture people. So I think for me. Particularly in this conference, the main title, Beyond the Culture Industry. As Lily said, I agree. We do not have to go back to the Adorno era. It's, I think, over. We cannot ignore market anymore. So this is an obvious fact. So we cannot ignore governmental policy intervention anymore. So we need, how we live with them is, I think, one thing we need to rethink together in this conference. So, in this sense, one question for me, just one question for your talk is, you suggested separation between the policy for the creativity for economic policy and also socio-cultural inequality. And I think maybe governmental implementation level, I think I agree. But as a scholar, as a practitioner, I think whether it is desirable or productive to separate the two issues, maybe for me it's much more interesting to how we consider how we can get them together in a more progressive manner. So this is a kind of what does it mean to do critical studies of culture now? So what kind of critical studies of culture is needed? So how we can combine critical and practical again? So we can, of course, act as being creatively critical as a researcher. So how our critical work to be more disseminated, to be led by wider populace, and to work with them to persuade many people, government. And also we can work as being critically creative, not just a scholar, but a practitioner, as a citizen, and also maybe administrator by ourselves. Not as an educator, but also working part of this bigger structure of cultural production. And so in this sense, I think I still like Adorno's words of not from his culture industry thesis, but culture and administration thesis. So how we ourselves can be a more such kind of critical practitioner. It's a quite urgent question, I think. So I think on one level, I think that how we separate and also combine again the governmental actual policy implementation and also as a critical studies of cultural policy. So these are, of course, always overlapping with each other. But if you have any idea, I think I should have. So let us. Thank you very much.